The Particular Abilities of Marinette and Her Discovery of Them by Plants Are Fun 06, A Miraculous Ladybug, Batman, Crossover Fanfiction. Chapter 3, Monster. It was strange to say the least, because even though this was sight, it was not sight at all, at least not like how she remembered it. When she saw it before, the world was filled with colors, but now there wasn't any color at all. There were not blues, not reds, not greens, not even black or whites. But yet she was still seeing. Maybe not seeing, more visualizing. Though Marinette knew they were technically synonyms. But this sight certainly wasn't actual sight. Not only that, but when she blinked, she still saw. When she moved her hand to cover her eyes, she still saw. And when she touched her eyes, the scars were still there. But she could see so much more than she could before. She could see the inside of trees, while still seeing the outside. She could see the mud under her feet, or rather very tiny things in the mud. But the most beautiful thing she thinks she has ever experienced was what was behind her. She could see it even though she wasn't facing that way. Do I have eyes on the back of my head now? No, that still wouldn't explain being able to see the inside of the tree. At this point, Marinette didn't think she was seeing with eyes at all. She could see what was behind her, but she wasn't prepared for what it felt like when she turned around. On quiet nights at Nandam Parbat, Marinette would often sneak out of her room and go to one of the unoccupied grand balconies, that high up into the mountains, and at night no less. It was bitter cold and always had a breeze. But oh, how Marinette loved it. Marinette loved the way it felt when the gusts of frigid wind would ripple over her, and occasionally the wind would be strong enough to push her over before she caught herself. She really loved it out there because it was completely silent. Sure, there were probably people watching her. It was Nandam Parbat, a compound filled with highly trained assassins referred to as the Shadows. They were watching her, and yet she was never punished for it. Whether Grandfather simply didn't care, or he was never told, she did not know. But whatever it was, she knew that she got some quiet moments of unpunished peace on those balconies. Ones where her mind would completely go blank and she would simply allow the cold wind to follow over her. This felt like the rolling winds over her skin. But instead of the bitter cold, it felt like billows of electricity rolling over her. The good kind of electricity, not the kind from the mean doctor after she was 15 minutes late to her martial arts lessons. It felt like a little jolt going straight to her muscles and forcing them to relax all the tension that had been built up in the last hour. Her ankle and nose eased of pain, and she physically felt the pressure releasing from her chest. She took a few steps out from under the tree with the complete control she lacked when she first walked into the meadow. Grass before felt like little feathers dusting her feet, making her want to laugh. Now it felt like the aloe the handmaids applied to her feet after walking across hot coals, the one time she was allowed to go to the hospital wing. She had snuck out after her bedtime to try and get chocolates that had been delivered to be used at a dinner for Grandfather's closest allies. Really, the hot coals were fine. She deserved it for going against the rules and possibly ruining the entire dinner. Marinette was expecting her hand to come off for such an offense. She was relieved when she just had to walk across coals, even if it did really hurt. In other words, the grass under her feet felt like pure and utter relief from the miles-long trek she endured, a good portion of which was done on bare feet. She started walking through the fields. She could see where the holes were and could just skip right over them. A drastic difference from her tripping over one of the many holes and crawling the rest of the way. It made a soft smile curl up her face and small giggles fall from her lips as she started to get more confident in herself. She felt like this confidence wasn't misplaced as it had been last time, and started to run through the field. Marinette couldn't see, but feel all the flowers. She could feel them all brushing against her legs as she ran and skipped over the field. Touching the flowers gave her the same euphoria against her skin that the grass did. The soothing jolt made her want to continue running. She lowered her hand to touch one of the flowers in particular. All the flowers were too overwhelming, so cupping them gave her a point to focus on. She could see that it had 6 petals, and a trumpet-shaped central cornea, and a heady floral scent, daffodil. She raised her hand to cup another flower. She could see that it had a multitude of small petals, but each and every one of those petals was a small floret of even smaller petals. A chrysanthemum. She saw a small bird flying overhead. She could tell it was several feet away, and she lost focus of it only a few seconds after she'd seen it. But something about seeing the bird out amongst the flowers just made her want to laugh. Marinette went around and tried to identify every flower she could remember from her survival lessons, where she learned to identify hundreds of plants and learn all of their purposes, whether it was food or medicinal. Some she knew would be poisonous and decided to steer clear of those and move along to others, identifying some crocus, aster, irises, buttercups, daffodils, roses, carnations, and coneflowers. Every single time she would cup them in her hands, she would be able to see every intricacy of the flower far better than ever before when they would bring in plates for her to study and identify for her exam and practices. It was all far more beautiful than she remembered flowers. They were overwhelming her senses. She was momentarily forgetting her breakdown that happened only a few moments earlier, all about how her grandfather had blinded her, thrown her out, stripped her of her name, and left her to die. Forgetting about her trek down the mountain, and her inability to navigate herself around the meadow and finding the stream. She even forgot that she was trying to find the stream. She simply laughed and ran around the field, before diving beneath a thicket of flowers and tracking all the small little bugs that were crawling in between the stems, down below the soil and into the roots. She could see them as they burrowed down a few inches and tracked them as they did what they needed. She had never seen the ground like this before. She had never seen it so alive. It was absolutely mesmerizing to track all the beetles and ants as they had their own little world right beneath her. She focused on a single ant, carrying down a small bit of what she could guess was honeydew or nectar, before coming down from her high and falling into a deep sleep within the walls of the flowers. It took a couple of weeks for Marinette to find any type of village. She knew there was one only a couple miles away from Nandam Parbat, but it was small, and if you did not know the exact place of it, it would be easily missed. Rather, Marinette walked what she could guess would be about 8 to 10 miles and found a much larger town. Going through the forest wasn't too difficult. At first, Marinette expected it to be possibly even easier than when she had her sight. That little fantasy was slightly demolished when she tripped over a rock and scraped her knee against a tree. It took all of 3 seconds to realize that all the rocks she felt under her, no matter how many times she would pick them up and focus on them, she could not see. She could see the trees and the plants and the dirt underneath her fingers, but she could not see the rocks. It confused her. She thought she could see. Granted, it wasn't really seeing. It was incredibly different. It was a strange kind of seeing. But nevertheless, she thought she could see. She could see the flowers. She could see the tree. She could see the soil. Why couldn't she see the rocks? If I can't see the rocks, can I not see other things? Marinette kept a furrow of confusion on her brow and slowly got up, being more wary of where she stepped. She kept her feet brushing the ground as she walked to avoid stepping on something she couldn't see. She found a bush with a bunch of little flowers on it. Only noticing when she cupped one of the flowers in her hand and focused on it, did she realize it was not a flower. but wild strawberries. Despite the popular belief that wild strawberries, and wild fruit in general, were poisonous, she knew for a fact from the basic survival courses she was taking that wild strawberry bushes were edible. Marinette had never moved her little hands so fast in her life. She practically ripped the strawberries from the bush, not even bothering with removing the stems from the berry, before shoveling it into her mouth, and barely even chewing it before she swallowed it. This was followed by eating. Inhaling would be a better description for what was occurring. More and more strawberries. It ended with Marinette lying on the ground, flat on her back, with a bloated stomach and groaning. Maybe I shouldn't have eaten so many strawberries as quickly as I did. About a half hour of allowing her body to heal from the influx of strawberries eaten, Marinette got up and rubbed her strawberry juice-covered fingers along her robe that had mostly dried of their originally dripping wet state. She continued that in almost a cycle. Walk a few hours, find a source of food, eat so much food it made her momentarily sick, repeat. Throwing sleep every 3 or 4 cycles, and a brief rumination on why she was eating all that food when she knew it would make her sick, always done when she was lying down feeling sick. When Marinette did finally reach the town, quite literally everything surprised her, because some things were floating. She was crouched down in the thicket of a bush that was on the edge of the forest, simply observing the village. It was the first time that she'd seen a person with this kind of seeing, but it was certainly one of the strangest experiences she ever had. The closest person was probably 30 to 40 feet away from her, but she could see all of them. While the anatomy classes did not start until she would be several years older, she had seen basic diagrams of the human body while learning basic target points on a person, and which were the most lethal. It was very important that you hit those. And when she was learning how to identify certain wounds, it was so she would know who to give up on, whatever that meant. So she knew what the basics of human anatomy were. She also knew that you shouldn't be able to see them. So Marinette was not only questioning why she couldn't see Rock, but why could she see the persons, boys. But when she noticed, she just let out a quiet giggle. Spleen? Because she knows for a fact that a spleen was not externally visible, along with all the other organs she was absolutely sure were supposed to be concealed by a layer of skin. But she could still see. Again, concerning. Then again, it's not like she couldn't see his skin. It was there, protecting all his internal organs. Maybe it was like the tree, where I can see the bark and the inside at the same time. She walked out of the bush. The only way she was getting any answers is if she talked to the boy, and that wasn't going to happen hiding in a bush. Upon walking only a few feet, she saw the boy's head turn and look her direction. She was still about 30 feet away, and was still learning exactly what this kind of seeing was, but her ears were in perfect working order. She knew this because she heard quite possibly the loudest, highest-pitched scream she had ever heard in her life, even louder than the ones she heard from the mean doctor's office. Even from far away, she still had to cover her ears at how high this boy was able to scream. "It's a monster! Umi! Umi, help! There's a monster!" That made Marinette turn around. This boy was yelling and saying there was a monster, and looking in her direction. So there was probably a monster sneaking up from behind her. Smart. But you failed when you gave yourself away and got noticed. Mother always said that the quickest way to fail was to get noticed and reveal yourself. But upon turning around to get into a fighting stance the League had trained into her to the point it was natural to drop into this stance when threatened, as it was breathing when coming up from water. But she saw no monster. I can't see it like I can't see rocks. Maybe that's why I couldn't see it despite being able to see in all directions. It could have been following me. She just stood there and listened. She should be able to hear the monster perfectly fine. But the boy was still screaming at the monster, and it was a little hard to hear over something so loud. At that point, Marinette was spinning around, trying to keep her battle stance while moving. It mostly ended up with her tripping and nearly falling on her butt, and keeping her focus on listening for any kind of movement. She kept focusing on the sound. It was a bit hard with how loud the boy was, but Marinette knew she would be able to hear something closer to her. She lost focus on searching for a sound the monster made when she heard a loud gasp and the screaming stopped. She saw that the boy was not alone anymore and had a woman with him. She was cradling his head and he was hiding it in her stomach and his arms wrapped around her. "Umi, there's a monster! Umi, there's a monster!" Marinette could still hear, but slightly muffled from where his face was pressed against what she could only guess was his mother. This time she could tell the mother was looking at her. "Me?" The woman started to wail a prayer. Marinette had heard it before from one of her teachers. He was Islamic, and it was a prayer of general protection from evil to the Islamic god Allah. She heard him say under his breath quite often. He was her language teacher, and it was likely the reason it was her favorite class. He would never hit her when she made mistakes, or tell her grandfather when she did poorly. He always said he believed in a thing called positive reinforcement. She didn't really know what positive reinforcement was, but she sure did love it. It made her feel good because when she messed up, he would help her and guide her through it. And when she succeeded, he would smile at her and tell her she was doing a good job. It always made her smile when he told her she did a good job. She probably would never see that man again. Marinette was broken from her thoughts by the woman only screaming louder and louder, pointing her finger at Marinette, at this point screaming even louder than the boy had been, while he was shaking in her arms and she was slowly backing away. She was yelling at her, and that thought broke Marinette. She turned through the forest and ran. She could feel tears running down her face. The tree limbs and the rocks scraped against her skin as the sound of the woman's prayer slowly fading as she continued to run deeper into the forest, with only thought running through her head. "I'm the monster,"